Hello, and welcome to the Wild Blue Podcast, perspectives on aviation lives, lifestyles, and business.
Well, hello everyone. My name's Todd Mitten with Wild Blue Aircraft Sales, and I am with
Chris Kirk. Welcome. Good to have you.
Chris. We've been spending these podcasts recently talking about some flying experiences and points of interest, but we are in the aircraft sales business, and you've been selling airplanes for how many years?
About 15 now.
Wow, 15. That's a lot of
maybe a little longer.
That's a lot of sales, well into the hundreds of sales I know that you've facilitated, and it brings up a question that I have, and I wonder if some of our listeners might have a question along the same lines, and that is, what gets in the way of a sale? What is the number one thing that you think gets in the way of a sale having a successful outcome? Whether you're trying to sell your airplane on your own or using a broker or however you're trying to sell it. I mean, I think this would probably apply. What do you think about that?
Well, that's a good point, because I think you're exactly right. It doesn't matter if it's being facilitated by someone or you're trying to do it on your own. But aviation and airplanes are extremely emotional things in the general aviation world. And so to me, it's a no-brainer that the number one thing that gets in the way of a successful sale is emotion.
Emotion? Well, what do you mean?
Well, it's funny because I've got friends that are in the jet sales world, the corporate sales world, and I've had them mention to me, even just kind of ask me, I don't know how you do it. And the first time I heard that, I'm like, what? They go, man, there's just so much emotion. They go, it's more of a business transaction at our level. And the guys down at, that are flying these airplanes that are the owner operators, somewhat of the pleasure crowd, they just get so wrapped up in these airplanes. It becomes part of their, part of their personality almost.
Well, sure. We argue about Cessna versus Piper or experimental versus manufactured, certified. So yeah, I would think so, that there's emotion involved in that.
And let's face it, I've never met a pilot, particularly a private pilot, who's not an expert. So we all tend to wear that, on our sleeves.
We like to keep that facade going that we're experts. No, that's interesting. So what would be an example, or let's talk about some examples of emotion. Let's talk about it first from a seller's point of view. What sort of seller emotion might we expect to run into?
I think the biggest thing that you can do, and I'd be interested to hear your perspective on this too, because this is certainly not the gospel truth, but to me, the biggest thing you can do as a seller is to step back from the airplane and stop assuming. Assuming gets you into so many different problems and troubles anywhere in life, for that matter. So stop assuming or making assumptions about buyers. Stop assuming, for example, that a buyer is going to appreciate everything that you've done to the airplane. Stop assuming that they're going to want to change it, or they're not going to want to change it. Stop assuming that out-of-the-country buyers are all crooks and drug dealers.
Interesting.
Stop all those assumptions and just realize that at the end of the day, if you want to get the most money in your pocket in the shortest period of time, and I have yet to have a seller tell us otherwise, that it is a inanimate and an inanimate object, and it's a sale of that object. And so the more you try to hold on to it like it's your baby and control it, the more often I see things not work out as well as they probably could.
Well, in the time that I have been working at Wild Blue with you, I have run into that type of a scenario myself on a number of occasions. We all feel that our aircraft is worth every penny because it means so much to ourselves. But what your point was to step back and look at it as it is, as an inanimate object. Now that doesn't mean that you can't offer some emotion in your discussion about the airplane, right? I mean, for example, we do owner videos, and I think part of the purpose of those owner videos, and you can elaborate on this, but part of the purpose is to show that the previous owner or the current owner who wants to sell the aircraft has positive feelings about that aircraft.
Yeah, they do. And that's important that they do. You know, I was just sitting here thinking, Todd, and maybe you've run into this before, but my wife's in real estate. And
Yes.
so you'll get people, and we've had this happen before, where we sell a house, and I've had people, I think even my mom was the last one to say this to me. She's like, "Oh my gosh, you guys fixed that up so much. Isn't it going to bother you that somebody else is going to do whatever?" I'm like, no, I could care less. It's their house now.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
Mm-hmm.
I could care less if they go in there and they paint it purple, and they bleach the yard white. I don't care because it's their house now. And so, if you step back from that, when I sold that house, I wanted to get the most out of it. We wanted to get it off the market in the shortest period of time. We wanted to get the most out of it. We get that it's your baby. But if you can just step away from that just a little bit. And what's funny, and we're all this way. So I'm pointing the finger at myself as much as anything else. We as buyers and sellers are interesting creatures. I think that's one of the things that I enjoy most about this business is the psychological aspect of working with people and, listening to their perspectives and learning about them and seeing what drives them and motivates them. But you also learn over time that there are these key phrases, right, that people say that, you can start to hear it. It's okay. I know he's going to say this. He's going to say, I don't want to give it away, but then almost always it's followed by, but I'm a pretty realistic guy, and so we have these things that we say as sellers, just like we do as buyers.
Sure.
'Cause what's the buyer going to say? I'm not going to overpay for that thing.
Yep. So as sellers, you mentioned sellers want to sell their airplanes. None have said, I just want it gone today or something. Typically, they want the most they can get for the aircraft. But what is, if any, what is the drawback to hanging on to the aircraft indefinitely? Why? I mean, let the sales cycle just wait for that price that you believe it's worth. What is there a cost involved?
Oh yeah, well there's a big cost involved, and of course anybody that's owned an airplane for any length of time understands this. You've got fixed costs that are eating away at the value of your airplane. I mean, my personal airplane here in Kansas City cost me $4,000 a year. Let me think about that. Probably a little more just for the hangar, right? So does it make sense for me to try to eke out an extra $4,000 and hold that airplane an extra 5 or 6 months just on hangar alone? Not to mention
insurance, tax, perhaps, other costs. An annual inspection that was 7 or 8 months off is now suddenly looming right in front of you.
That's I hadn't thought about that, Todd. That's a good point, because the emotion doesn't necessarily deal with both the buyer and the seller, as they're trying to go back and forth, but it deals just as much as trying to get to the point where you're ready to release the airplane.
Yes.
And that's a really good point, because a lot of people will kind of mess around for a while, toy around with the idea. And let me ask you this: how many different sellers have you had that you've worked with that have told you, I probably should have sold this a long time ago?
Yeah, I've heard that, or they're happy when it's sold, of course, and we do. I think that as you know, you do follow up with all of our clients, and we get feedback from all of our clients, and we do get positive reviews. But I do think that there are those that have thought they should have taken an earlier offer once the opportunity came. We don't force anybody to take any offer. That's not our prerogative.
That's right.
We're here to facilitate the sale.
Right.
But we're going to offer honest advice, and often that's no, this is not a good offer. But on the other hand, sometimes world situation, as we saw with the recent or coronavirus events, can change very quickly. So when you're holding on to an aircraft and waiting for that perfect offer, that you may want to recognize what else could come up.
Yeah. And that's, and on the flip side of it is you look at buyers, and buyers can get just as emotionally attached or emotionally involved as well. And they, sometimes they're emotionally involved with their own paradigm. They've got a way of thinking that they've been trained to think in terms of aviation that may or may not be right. Because depending on who they're getting their advice from or who they've learned from, there's a lot of folklore in aviation, right?
There is.
A lot of people sit around and everybody shoots off their opinion, and sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong, and so they've heard this a lot of times. If it's a newer person from their CFI, okay, I appreciate their CFI, but their CFI probably is not in the business of buying and selling, and so they'll bring these thoughts and these ideas in, and man, they get attached to them, and if you challenge them on that at all, it's just. We got to tread that water carefully.
Well, it's okay because today, Chris, you can get onto Facebook and get the real answer.
That's right. That's right.
And obviously I'm being facetious, and I want to bring that up is because I see it, and I don't know if you do, but I follow some different aviation aircraft, both sales sites as well as type sites. Whether it's Bonanza or Piper sites.
Right, and local aviation groups.
Local aviation groups are a great example. And so, rightly, I suppose, people put questions on there. Hey, what do you think my airplane is worth? Well, I just don't know if that's a very good idea to ask the general public that question, but it is an option. What do you think?
Yeah, I think you're right. Because unless you have the ability to write the check and are going to right now, frankly, I don't think your opinion matters. Because it's not that we don't care about your opinion, but it's that if you don't have the wherewithal or the motivation to buy right now that particular asset, you really don't know what you're talking about.
Well, I think even more accurately than that, if you are not the person spending the money, then you can say whatever. It's easy to spend someone else's money. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yep.
And so while you may have an accurate opinion in that case, or the person may have an accurate opinion, and it's certainly worth listening to. Keep in mind, they're not the ones writing the check. So, you sort of started on the subject of buyers, and so if you don't mind, let's move on and talk about buyer emotion a little bit. What are some examples of negative, positive emotions that you've seen from buyers? Well,
how we mentioned that sellers kind of need to get out of their own way and let buyers see the airplane from their eyes. A buyer needs to also understand that seller did not equip that airplane or upgrade that airplane specifically for them. They didn't do it for the buyer. So a buyer that says, oh gosh, well, I wish it had this, or I wish it had that. Okay. But it doesn't. And so if you need to kind of step back and realize from an emotional perspective, I'm going to step into this airplane and I know that there's things I'm going to have to do, whether it's an upgrade of avionics, maybe I'm going to have to do paint, maybe there's going to be some maintenance. Maybe it's just, I don't like the color of the pillows that are in the back.
Well, I think that, we at Wild Blue spend so much of our time dealing with aircraft that were, probably sometime manufactured sometime in the 1970s, mid to late 70s, up through maybe 2015. That's where we generally are operating. That's where we buy or where we sell airplanes. And a lot of these aircraft have been upgraded in recent years, and some have not. As a buyer, is it better to buy an aircraft that has been upgraded, or is it better to upgrade it on your own?
Yeah, and definitely a good subject we could talk about. I think the general consensus, certainly is mine, if I can buy it the way I want it, then it's cheaper to do that than it is to, buy it the other way. And if we get on this kind of along those same lines, get on the topic of the emotion from the buyer, one of the things that we see that buyers will do, and that I always coach if we have a customer who has hired us to help them with the acquisition, I always try to coach them through this. Don't get so emotionally attached to an airplane that you can't walk away from it. Same advice applies to buying a car or buying a house. There are other airplanes out there. Flip side of it is, for a seller, there's other buyers out there as well.
Yes.
But
but the point I think that you made me think of there is that automobiles, unless we're talking a unique, a 69 Camaro, you got to have a 69 Camaro or something. The reality is, if you want a 2007 to 2010 Toyota Camry, there's literally thousands out there for sale, and they're all pretty similar. You can get in now to specifics on mileage and condition, but the reality is it's a Toyota Camry. There's a lot of them, and they're very similar. Airplanes are not like that.
No, you're
There's
right.
a limited number of A36 Bonanzas or a limited number of Piper Saratogas in a given year range or whatever. Some years there's more than others, but the reality is, on a given day, when you look at controller or trade a plane, there may be only 10 of that whole model for sale and only 2 or 3 within the year range that you want. So as a buyer, you have to be a little bit flexible, I think, in what you're willing to accept, be it condition, color, airframe time, whatever it may be.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, because there's, like you said, there's so many different options that can change as an airplane comes out of the factory to when it's being sold. Lots of things can have been done to the airplane, and maybe even damage history. And so, there might be nothing out there that is exactly the way you want it. In fact, the best way to procrastinate is to look for perfection. And if you're looking for that specifically perfect, that right airplane, you might as well just quit looking right now, because you're gonna, I hate to use the word settle, but you're gonna have to settle on something, right? I mean, you're gonna compromise on something.
Okay, so you and I are a buyer and a seller, and we've reached an agreement now on the price. And what's the next step? Maybe we can go down this rabbit trail a little bit and discuss the pre-buy inspection and emotions that could be involved in that.
Well, that's where emotions start to flare, isn't it?
I think so. And I knew that. So tell me some stories about that.
Well, you tell me, how many sellers have we talked to over the years that say, they're not going to find anything. They're not going to find anything on that inspection.
Oh, I believe all of them.
And we all like to think that our mechanics are perfect, that our airplanes are perfect. But hey, this is a complex piece of machinery, right?
And what was perfect 2 or 3 hours of flying ago is not perfect now.
Yeah, I mean, I've had 1-year-old airplanes go through pre-buys, and they've found numerous squawks. We're talking airplanes with less than 100 hours on them. So you have to be prepared as a seller to know that, there's going to be stuff. And I think we, for the most part, do a good job, again, of coaching our customers that, let's get rid of that notion that there's not going to be anything wrong with this airplane. That's what this guy's being paid for, right? That's what the shop is being paid for. They're going to find something.
Yeah, exactly. I think a buyer who has contracted or hired a mechanic to do a pre-buy inspection, and then who has the mechanic say, no, there's absolutely nothing wrong, would say, did you look at this airplane? I don't think any of us as buyers would believe that. So we need to emotionally, mentally accept that.
And here's, I'll give you a quick story. So my first airplane that I bought was a Cherokee 140 back in 1994. I was 26 or 27 years old. And so, so all these lessons learned that have built this business into what it is today, because we all, as we've talked about in a previous podcast, we come together and we have these after action reviews, and we learn from things and we apply it to the next customer so that the experience just continues to get better. And anyway, so I bought this airplane. I've been looking for one. This is back in the day when if you wanted pictures of it, you kind of had to call the guy up. Even if it was on the internet, there were no pictures, and you had to wait 2 or 3 days for pictures to show up in the mail. So you couldn't think yourself to death, really. I mean, like you can today. You can look at hundreds of options and never make a decision. But so I bought this airplane. It was semi-local, and the good news is it turned out to be a good airplane. But who did the pre-buy? His mechanic.
Oh.
Because I was stupid. Guess what? No squawks. Man, this is a great airplane. Yes. There's nothing wrong with it. And so, it didn't take me very long. I think I was probably leveling on the flight on the way home thinking, I'm not sure that was the most objective experience I've ever had.
Yeah, well, to be honest, we advise buyers. We don't let the seller's aircraft go 500 miles or 1,000 miles somewhere for a pre-buy, but we do want it to be a fair pre-buy. At Wild Blue, our perspective is a fair pre-buy. So
an independent third party.
That is the best scenario when it comes to pre-buy inspections. So as a seller, when your aircraft goes in, Chris mentioned when your aircraft goes in for a pre-buy, you have to expect that there will be a few, maybe more than a few issues to be resolved. But conversely, as a buyer, you have to be aware that the airplane is a used airplane. It's not going to be perfect.
You hit it right on the head.
And you just have to accept that as part of the deal if you want to be an aircraft owner. If you don't want to accept that, then move on. I guess.
We ran into that recently with an extremely nice airplane, and I don't believe this buyer said this, but I've heard it from so many that is this airplane perfect? Nope, never seen one. I've never seen anything perfect.
No.
And so if you go into it thinking it's going to be perfect. So we try to coach the buyer as well that, hey, there's going to be items that come up here. And some of them are important, some of them aren't, depending on the shop and, how in depth they go and what they're trying to reveal to the buyer based on future maintenance needs or whatever the case may be. So,
well, sure. And not to interrupt you, but these mechanics are pointing out some things that, hey, you may want to consider this down the road.
Right.
So not necessarily something that they're even really recommending be done right now, but we had an airplane recently that was purchased and then only 6 months later was sold by the person that purchased it previously 6 months ago. And in the original pre-buy, there was a problem with one of the mufflers, but the mechanic said that is something that's going to have to be taken care of probably in the next 100 hours. And then when the aircraft was sold, the mechanic that did the pre-buy found that same issue with the muffler and said, well, that's got to be repaired. But that was actually predicted in the previous pre-buy 6 months earlier, because they did fly it probably 100 hours. They flew it quite a bit in that short 6 months, realizes that they needed more performance than that aircraft had brought them. But it points out what I'm getting at is sometimes these are items that don't need to be repaired today, but the mechanic is making you, the buyer, aware of future issues. So again, the emotion aspect of this as a seller, you can't get super offended by that. It's an accurate call, and that's a good example of how that plays out in the real world and stuff you and I have dealt with.
Right. Yeah, and don't let the emotion as a buyer get to you to where you are you're looking for that perfection, and you maybe as you're going through this process, people tend to set an expectation that may be a little too high on the airplane, and it doesn't have any bearing necessarily on how the previous owner or the current owner took care of it. It just is a matter of you've got a different set of eyes looking at this. Again, it's a very complex piece of machinery, and take it as, hey, I'd like to get as much information on this thing as I possibly can, because it's a learning experience for you. And of course, if it's not doesn't pass muster for you, and you can walk away from it, then maybe that's what you should do. But if you can try to be as objective about it as you possibly can, I think in the long run, as the buyer, it's also going to save you money.
Well, Chris, I think this is a very fascinating discussion. And I mean, do you have any other thoughts on buyer, seller, emotion?
You know what they say about opinions.
Yeah.
But
Well, I do think it's something that we can help you with as a seller or as a buyer. We will talk about this subject. We're happy to talk about this subject with you. Give us a call at Wild Blue. Our office number is 816-479-2723. Look us up on the internet, www.flywildblue.com. Take a look at the pictures we take, the videos we take, and the work we do, and then we'd like to discuss it with you anytime. So we appreciate you listening and wish you a best day.
Yeah, thanks, folks. Happy flying.
Thanks for listening to the Wild Blue Podcast. Find us online at flywildblue.com. And don't forget to subscribe and share.